here, and I'm happy to be following Ted because I'm also going to talk about underlying factors. In fact, this presentation is called Bailing While the Boat Has Holes. We're looking at the underlying holes in our boats. The Israelis, as you know, as you follow the news every day, were subjected to many rockets and mortars and things, and I have statistics, and I said I wasn't going to use them, but Ben asked me to please give you numbers. So I will. 2,500 rockets fired at Israel in 2012, 3,700 rockets since 2009, 13,000 rockets in the last 12 years. But that is not what Operation Defensive Pillar was about. It was not about the rockets that have been fired at Israel from Gaza. It was instead really about the discovery by Israel that Hamas had acquired about 100 Iranian Fajr 5 longer-range rockets. And those, for Israel, were unacceptable in Gaza. You know, somebody took out a whole bunch of those things in Sudan in October, and people say somebody with quotation marks. But they didn't take them all out. And the Israelis discovered that there were about 100 of them that had slipped the cordon. And even in the Middle East, even among Israelis and Palestinians, there are acceptable and unacceptable forms of weaponry. Fajr 5s were unacceptable. Let me explain why. The other rockets, everything up to Fajr 5s that were in Hamas's hands, had made life difficult for about 1 million Israelis in the south of the country. That is equivalent to about 44 million Americans. If you superimpose the radius of those other rockets on New York, it is much bigger than Hurricane Sandy land. It goes up to White Plains, New York. It goes west into New Jersey. It is a much bigger radius than what we saw in terms of the hurricane. And the hurricane was a one-off. And this is a constant series of things happening. Iranian Fajr 5s add Tel Aviv, Israel's commercial capital, and Jerusalem, Israel's national capital, to rocket range. That means another 1.2 million Israelis in the two cities. It means another 500,000 Israelis or so who live between the cities. That is the equivalent of another 75 million Americans being subject to rocket fire. Add them to the first 44 million, you have 120 or so million Americans running for shelter in the space of 15 seconds. That is to shelter yourself. It is to shelter your small children. It is to shelter your elderly parents. God forbid your toddler should be in the bathroom, right? 15 seconds, not enough time. So when you add all of that together, and we would look at that as a third of the American population, and the Israelis looked at that as a third of their population, it was unacceptable. Those things had to go. Hence, Operation Pillar of Fire. Now, Hamas, knowing that the Israelis were coming, was desperate to lure them in on the ground, because Hamas remembers Israel's incursion into Lebanon in 2006. It was a very badly constructed operation in 2006. They started with an air war. They finished with a ground war. The ground war was not very well thought through, and it resulted in about 118 Israeli military casualties, and Hamas was just salivating over the idea of 118 Israeli service casualties. So they built traps, they built booby traps, they built minefields, they dug tunnels. They were all prepared for an Israeli ground war. And what they did was increase the rocket fire during the beginning of Pillar of Fire, not because they thought it would hurt so many more Israelis. They are well aware of the capability of Iron Dome, but because they thought the Israelis would rise up and say to their government, do something. Do something. And when a government does something, as opposed to when a government thinks about what needs to be done, they tend to do different things. So the Israeli government, instead of doing something, decided what it needed to have done, and it did only that. Okay, so 1,600 targets were hit in Gaza. They got the Fajrs, they got the launchers, they got a lot of other capabilities. They knocked off about 30 senior Hamas people, many of whom had spent a fair amount of time in Iran learning things that they did not have time to transmit to other Hamas operatives in Gaza, which is like a twofer. You know, not only did they get rid of those guys, but they stopped the transmission of the information they had in their heads. I have not yet figured out, perhaps someone can tell me, whether these guys still get their virgins in the afterlife, since they got knocked off and they didn't take any infidels with them, I'm not sure. But they took out about 30 of those guys. They also staged a huge mobilization exercise. They mobilized about 10,000 troops in 2006, 75,000 troops in this last exercise. It was a perfect mobilization. Reserves found their equipment, they found their ammunition, they found their uniforms, they found their tanks, they found everything was orderly, everything was organized. So for the Israeli public, when you have a combination of a government that's clear about what its goals are, a mobilization that is successful, which reassures people that they will be safe. And you have Iron Dome, which took down about 84% of the rockets it was intended to take down. Remember, Iron Dome works in two ways. It doesn't go after rockets and missiles that are aimed at empty spaces. It only plans to intercept rockets and missiles that are aimed at population centers. So some people say it only hit about 60% of the Palestinian rockets. Yes, total. But about 85% of those that were aimed at populated areas, which means the Israeli public was not faced with huge casualties, which means that the Israeli government was not faced with huge casualties. And so although the Israeli public was prepared for a ground invasion, and it would have supported a ground invasion was not necessary to reach the goals of the Israeli government. Consequently, there wasn't one. Which not only is better for the Israelis, it's better for the Palestinians. I mean, the actual casualty figures, as nearly as we can tell, about 170 Palestinians were killed. About 120 of them, according to the Israelis, with some Palestinian agreement that it was about 120 were Hamas operatives. That leaves about 50 civilians. One terrible case, truly terrible case, 11 civilians were killed at once, including children. Other than that, very, very poor operation. In 1,600 sorties, they killed about 40 people. So much for carnage in Gaza. And to Ted's point, there are people who would like to charge Israel with war crimes. There are people who would like to do it as a matter of principle. But if you look at the facts, it won't happen. Doesn't happen. So Israel won. I mean, I know Hamas is taking a kind of loopy victory dance, and they're thanking Iran for the capability to kill a lot of people. Israel won. The problem is that Israel won this round. This is where you go to underlying causes, and this is where you go to the boat with the holes in the bottom. The United States and Israel are both operating on a principle in the Middle East of restricting what people have and what they do with it. We're trying to restrict the Iranians in their nuclear progress. We're trying to restrict the kinds of weapons that go to the Syrian rebels. I'll talk about that in a minute. And we're trying to restrict the kind of weapons that go to Hamas and Hezbollah, and it doesn't work. You can't do it. You cannot cordon off the world. We have sanctions on Iran, and I'm a skeptic, okay? There are two kinds of sanctions. There are sanctions that try to keep people from getting things, and there are sanctions that punish people who've already gotten things. The sanctions to keep Iran from getting things have not worked. They've gotten things. There's always somebody willing to bust a sanction. There's always a bank willing to finance that for enough money, and the Iranians have money. So now we're into punishment sanctions, and punishment sanctions do not work. Saddam Hussein had plenty of money, plenty of palaces, plenty of over-the-top stuff, all during the years of the Iran sanctions. Fidel Castro has never missed dinner, or Raoul. Kim Jong-un appears perfectly well-fed while there is famine in North Korea. So punishment sanctions don't really work either. That's Iran. Syria, we, the United States, are in an awkward position vis-a-vis Syria. We have said formally that we will not supply them with weapons because we are concerned that the weapons may end up in the hands of al-Qaeda. And yet we have said to our friends in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, you do it. One of the things we did not want to find in the hands of the rebels, but I'm not sure that we could stop it, was shoulder-fire SA-7 rockets. Shoulder-fire rockets, which are now in the hands of the Syrian rebels. And this was not what we intended. And it may have something to do with Benghazi, and it may have something to do with Ambassador Stevens, but that's a separate issue. Those shoulder-fire rockets are driving the Turks crazy and driving the Russians crazy, and consequently, they are driving us crazy, because we do not want to be on the wrong side of the Turks, and we do not want to be on the wrong side of the Russians. From the Turkish point of view, those things can find their way now into the hands of the Kurdish rebel groups, which means that they can find their way into the Turkish Kurdish rebels. If you remember Afghanistan, the Russians used helicopters in Afghanistan to put down the Afghans. The Turks use helicopters against the Kurdish rebels. Most of Turkey's war against the Kurds is helicopters. SA-7s in the hands of the Kurdish rebels would be hell for Turkey. The Russians are being driven nuts by this. They were, in fact, the first ones who said that there were SA-7s in the region, because although they believe they have pacified Chechnya, it only took them 180,000 or 190,000 casualties, which makes Bashar al-Assad look like a piker, right? He's only up to 40. A couple of shoulder-fire rockets in the hands of Chechen Sunnis would start the war all over again, and the Russians do not want to do that. So our problem here is we handed off the arming of the Syrian rebels to the Qataris and the Saudis, and what we didn't plan on is that they are not fighting our war. They are not fighting simply to remove Bashar al-Assad from power. They are fighting the Sunni-Shia big war. So for them, rockets in the hands of the Sunnis, whether they're Chechen Sunnis or they are Muslim Brotherhood or whatever they are, that's fine with them. It's not a problem for them because they're fighting the big war, and we're fighting the small war. So we're fighting the small war. We've helped Israel in the small war. We have helped Israel with the interdiction of Iranian weapons at sea, which is a good thing. The Israelis have interdicted numerous ships. They have boarded ships. They have taken off weapons, and that's all fine. The U.S. did not say anything about that Yarmouk missile factory in Sudan. The U.S. didn't say anything when the Israelis started taking out the Fajr rockets in Gaza. I have to say, and it kills me to say, the administration was really outstandingly good on the subject of Operation Pillar of Fire. Frank, I hope you got that on tape because it isn't going to happen again. No, okay. They were outstandingly good, but they are good in a limited sense because the operation is only good in a limited sense. Between the United States and Israel, they can't stop it all. The next round of Fajrs will come. Israel cannot police the whole Sinai. It cannot police Sudan. It cannot police the whole Red Sea. It cannot police the whole Mediterranean, the whole Persian Gulf, the whole Arabian Sea. Can't happen. Israel will catch what Israel will catch. But that's why it's like bailing while the boat has hulls. You catch it over here and it comes up over there. The U.S. tried to keep those SA-7s in their hands. They tried not to let them get out. But the U.S. cannot police Qatar and Saudi Arabia in what they send to Turkey for distribution or what they bring in directly to the Syrian rebels. We can't police Iran and what they send through Iraq to the Syrian government. What happens in the Syrian government now very often gets into the hands of the rebels. So we'll catch what we can catch, but again, you're bailing. In the long term, unless you get rid of the sources of the problem, unless you get rid of the sources of evil, which would be Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, Sudan's government. Remember Omar Bashir? 2 indictments at the International Criminal Court, again, to Ted's point. There are some people you want to bring to court and you actually do it, and then there are some people you indict them and you don't really care. Do you know that Sudan was just elected to the UN Human Rights Council with more votes than the Palestinians got yesterday for statehood? Okay, think about that. Not only Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, Sudan, you have to get rid of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, frankly. Those people are arming and funding the Sunni jihad side of this. Okay, Iran is funding the Shiite side of the jihad. Our friends, our ostensible friends, are funding the Sunni side. Turkey and Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood countries. The United States thinks they're moderate. We say they're moderate. We say less about Egypt today than we did last week. But those guys are going in the wrong direction, not the right direction. They are more repressive, more Islamic-oriented, less tolerant of others. They will not get better. They will get worse. So again, you're bailing. And that is the nature of the problem. And that's where I'm going to conclude. The problem is bigger than whether Israel can do any set of limited things, reach any set of limited objectives in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank. It can, and it will, and it can do bigger ones and it can do better ones. But unless we deal with the sources of evil in the region, you're going to find the next round coming. Thank you.
Shoshana, that was superb. Thank you. Quick question. I think it's the New York Times today has some of what seem to be the usual suspects cavilling about whether Iron Dome was effective, not the 60% versus 85%, but whether the 85% of what they really went after panned out. Do you have any thoughts on that or insights into where the truth lies? I know the Israelis have said, no,
yes.
no, it really worked.
Let's just say that the Israelis overstated their case by half. Instead of 84, it was more like, 42. Or even by a factor of 4. What you had in the whole entire war were 5 Israeli deaths. Okay? So it worked. And it kept the Israeli public from making demands of the Israeli government. So it worked. Is it 84%? Is it 72%? Is it 112%? Like voting in Florida where they had 141%. It doesn't really matter. The percentages do not matter. What matters is whether Iron Dome allowed the Israeli government and the Israeli people to be protected in a way that allowed them to make rational decisions without pressure. So it worked.
Good. 1 or 2 questions before we turn to our next presenter. Ben, do you have a mic?
Yeah. Shoshana, can you talk a little bit about the likelihood of the use of chemical weapons by either Hamas or perhaps by Hezbollah on the Lebanese side?
I'd really rather not. It's such a distressing subject, Ben.
I know.
Okay, Here's what I think. You have to be a mind reader. You have to read Assad's mind, and I cannot. But if Assad thinks that at the end of time, he needs asylum somewhere else for himself, his wife, his kids, and his friends, he won't use them, and neither will anybody else on his side. Because if you use chemical weapons, nobody will give you asylum. If you use chemical weapons, you're going to die tomorrow morning, because the Israelis are not going to permit you to get out and have asylum. So Assad says things like, I'm Syrian and I'm going to die in Syria. He has to choose when. If he chooses to use chemical weapons, he has chosen to die then. So I think as long as, and I think the Russians are right, the Russians hold out the option for him of asylum elsewhere. If he thinks he's going to take it, he will not use chemicals, because that would wreck the plan. If he really thinks he's going to go out in a blaze of glory and he thinks that's glory, then the bets are off. I'm holding out for asylum. I think it's going to be asylum.
But here's the kicker. As you certainly know, Shoshana, and I suspect everybody in the room does, according to that estimable source of knowledge, the New York Times, there are between 30 and high 40 number of chemical weapon sites in Syria. There are Hezbollah units now that have established training facilities adjacent to these. And as we've seen, the rebels are now overrunning Syrian bases and facilities and absconding with the weapons and making use of them. It seems to me, quite apart from whatever Bashar Assad might decide, that the control of those is uncertain, to say the least. And one of the other things that I happened to talk to Eric Schmidt of the New York Times on our radio show this morning, so I have this top of mind. He had a piece in the, I think it was earlier this month, saying that the Pentagon's assessment is that they need 75,000 troops to secure those sites and to take such steps as one might to try to dispose of their contents, in situ, presumably. So this is kind of messy, to say the least. And how does that factor into the big picture?
But the calculus is the same, Frank, whether it's Assad that you're worried about or Hezbollah that you're worried about or the rebels. Anybody who plans to live won't use them. Hezbollah is constrained in a variety of ways in what it will do. It offered Hamas no support, no help. It could have. It would have made Israel's life very much more difficult if they'd shot some rockets off from Lebanon. Instead, the Lebanese army found some rockets and dismantled them, made sure that they didn't go off. Hezbollah is in an increasingly fragile position inside of Lebanon. To take control of those chemical weapons and use them, the price would be paid by Lebanon. And that would be the end of Hezbollah's ability to influence events there. Hezbollah wants to live. They wish to live. Same is true of the rebels. Would they like to use chemical weapons on Israel? Yes, they would. But what is the payoff for doing it? You'll kill some Israelis, for sure. But the idea that you are then going to rule Damascus? No.
Yeah. Well, the trouble with thinking about
75,000 troops
about Hezbollah and its ilk wanting to live is, as you alluded to, there is this sort of notion that this jihad thing can actually give them an afterlife that's better than the present. But just a further thought, and there's no answer to this, I don't think, but just a further thought, Shoshana, is that as with these man-pad surface-to-air missiles, the theater in which these things can be employed is not confined to Israel or even the Middle East. These things could wind up here, among other places, especially since, as some on the Hill have been pointing out, we now have Hezbollah operating with drug cartels in Mexico and the like. So this is not a
Or they could
problem.
sail off from Venezuela and sit off the coastal waters of the United States, and
Indeed.
JFK is in line.
Indeed.
But let me just say about jihad, I completely agree with you. There are people who believe that the afterlife, if not as good as this one, will be maybe even better than this one. It tends, however, to be for someone else. The leadership tends to wish for someone else to have those virgins and not itself. So you find the Iranian government not really interested in jihad for itself. It gives little kids keys and sends them off in the minefields, or, you know, the Palestinians send other people's children. So the guys that they're training to do this, the leadership is not itself particularly interested in finding virgins, or at least not otherworldly virgins.
Well, this is an argument for doing what